In this video, I'll show you how you can use pivot tables to ask specific questions and gain insights about data in your Microsoft Excel workbooks. Welcome to Hey Ivan, a channel where people ask tech questions. Got a tech question? Drop a comment and I'll give you an answer. Don't have a question? Click like to show your support for this channel. Thanks. Before we get started, I've created chapters to help you jump exactly to the section you want in this video. Let's get started. There are three reasons that people come to Microsoft Excel. The first is they have a large list of data that they'd like to manage. The second is they'd like to perform calculations using functions and formulas. And the third is they'd like to summarize large amounts of information using reports like charts, graphs, or even pivot tables. That's what we're going to be talking about today. When you're preparing to use pivot tables, it's important that you structure your data so that you can use Excel to its best advantage. You may have noticed that Excel is arranged in rows that go across and columns that go up and down. To the extent you can arrange your data that way, you'll be putting yourself in a position where you can win. Just to be clear, let me jump into Excel and show you exactly what I mean. If you look here, my Excel data is arranged in rows that go across and columns that go up and down. And in Excel, I like to think of what I'm using my pivot table for is a list of items. So in this case, I have a list of people. This is a fictitious human resources list, the names generated from a random name generator that I found online. Let me show you. Bill Stokes, he's the first person in my list of data. I've arranged each item, each row to be an item in my list. So I have row 2 is a person, row 3 is a person, row 4 is a person, and so on. Each column is something specific about the person in my list. Column A is the first name, column B is the last name, column C is the employee number, and so on. I recommend against combining two different types of information into a same column. For example, you might try and put a phone number in combination with a street address. If you do that, you'll find that it's difficult for you to sort or filter, perhaps by zip code, because the two different types of information live together in the same cell. So instead, what I recommend you do is add another column to your data to define that other attribute you'd like to track. Now, Excel doesn't care if you arrange your data by rows and columns. In this case, rows are people and columns are attributes. Or if you organize your data as columns and rows, where columns might be people and rows might be attributes. You can do either. They work just as well. However, I think better using rows as the items in my list. So that's what I'll be showing you today. Now that we've structured our data to take advantage of how Excel is organized, let's go ahead and create a pivot table. In this video, I'm using Excel 365 in Microsoft Windows. However, much of what I discuss works in pretty much any version of Microsoft Excel, although the commands might be a little bit different. So in this version of Excel, we're going to go to the Insert tab, and you'll notice that in the first group, the Tables group, there are three different things we can choose from. Today, we'll be choosing pivot tables, and I'm just going to click on the top of the split menu, and that's going to open up this dialog box here. This dialog box asks us for a couple of things. One, to select the table or range that your Excel data is located. Well, it turns out I've already got my cell in my Excel data, and I should also mention that when you're arranging your data, try to avoid blank rows or blank columns because Excel tends to interpret a blank row as a division between one set of data and another. In my case, all of my data is together. I have no blank rows and blank columns. So Excel has guessed correctly that I'd like to use all of the data it selected as part of my pivot table. The next question it asked me is whether I'd like the pivot table to exist on a new worksheet or on an existing worksheet that's already in my workbook. I'll choose New Worksheet and click OK. As soon as I do that, I get a pivot table on its own sheet, and you'll notice that this sheet has a clever name, Sheet 2. The very next thing I do after I insert a pivot table into my workbook is I rename the sheet so that I can find it again later. So I'm going to call this one Pivot just to make it easy, and I'll also right-click on the tab and I will assign a tab color so that it's easier for me to see this if I'm in a workbook that has lots and lots of tabs. It'll be really easy for me to discover where I left that pivot table. But now that we've inserted the pivot table and we've named the worksheet appropriately, let's talk about the anatomy of a pivot table. You'll notice when you click inside of the pivot table, A ribbon tab appears. This one's called PivotTable Analyze, and it has a number of PivotTable tools that exist. As soon as I click away from my pivot table onto the sheet somewhere else, that pivot table ribbon vanishes, and as soon as I click back inside the pivot table, that PivotTable Analyze tab reappears. On the right-hand side, you'll see 5 different regions here. There's a list of fields, there's a filter, column, row, and value area where you can drag fields in your table. The way I describe this to people is if you look back at your Employees tab, if we look here at the other sheet, you'll see that I've got a number of columns. I have a first, a last, employee number, an extension, and so on. If I look here at the Pivot tab, in the Pivot Table Fields area, I'll see the very same column headings that I saw on the other sheet. The difference is that each one of these labels, first, last, employee number, and so on, represents all of the rows that fall beneath it on my other sheet. That'll be important in just a few moments. Here at the bottom, I've got 4 areas where I can place my fields, and we'll talk about that next. Let's first talk about rows. Let's say that I wanted to take department and drop it into the row area to see what would happen. If I go back over to the employees sheet, you can see here I have a number of values that repeat up and down the department. I've got litigation, accounting, administration. If I click the filter drop down here, you'll see that I've got about, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different values that appear up and down this column. Under the pivot table, and the thing that's powerful about it is that this department column here represents all of those values that we saw in the column on the other sheet. If I drag the department and I drop it into the row area, Excel looks down the column, it extracts the unique values, and it lists them in the row area. Notice that in the row area over here on our pivot table, each of the values that it found appears as its own row. That is the magic of pivot tables. And what's happening behind the scenes is that whether there were 1 or 10 or 15 of each of those values, they're all grouped together. And later, when I drag things into the values area, it will do some math and calculate subtotals based on those different groupings. But before we do that, let's talk about where the pivot table gets its name. A pivot is a central point on which a mechanism rotates or oscillates. And so far, when we've dragged department down to the row area, each item shows as its own row. If we take department and we move it over to the columns area, the table will pivot, it'll rotate, and now each one of those same values is shown as its own column, as opposed to its own row. Rows and columns, they do exactly the same thing, it's just one of them stacks the items vertically and the other distributes them horizontally across several columns. So let's put department back into the row area. Now what I'd like to do is show you the values area. This is where the math happens. And the math can either be counting, summing, averaging, or whatever other mathematical function is available in Excel. So let's do this. Let's take the year-to-date travel expenses and drag them and drop them into the values area. When we do that, we'll see some values here. Now, it turns out that what Excel is doing is it's looking down those columns, and for every corporate row, it finds any value that's in the year-to-date item and it collects them together and adds them up. So we can see very easily we're answering a question. We've asked a question of our Excel workbook. That question is, can you show me the total in expenses, the total year-to-date expenses by department? And we can see here very handily that the litigation department has spent the most in travel expenses year-to-date. So how can we make this data look like money? So what we're going to do is position our mouse over here where it says sum of year-to-date travel expenses. We're going to click that drop down and choose field value settings, which brings up a dialog box that allows us to adjust how this math is happening. This is a sum, and if we click this button here for number format, we can choose to format the number in a different way. We're going to choose to format this as accounting with a $ and 2 decimal places, and when we click OK and we click OK again, now this looks more like money. We've spent, within this whole grouping of people on the other sheet, a total of $104,933 on year-to-date expenses. Of that, $70,994 were from the litigation department. The information technology department spent $1,576, and all of this information comes to us because we're using a pivot table. It's just leveraging the data that's already there, presenting it in a way that's easier to understand. It's a summary. Now, a moment ago, I showed you how the row area and the column area allow you to display your data in different ways. If I wanted to, I could take department and throw it here in the column area, and it's showing us the very same information just in another way. But what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to divide. I want to compare. I want to see how my year-to-date expenses are by department, and I want to compare that against how the year-to-date expenses are distributed by office. And all we need to do is drag office and drop it into the column area, and now we see a nice comparison. Across each row, I've got the different offices. So these are multiple columns each office. At the very end of the row, this is the total for the corporate department. As a department, down here vertically, I've got Chicago, Las Vegas, Los Angeles. So each column shows me the breakdown for that department within the column, and at the bottom I see the total for the office, so I get a nice comparison. This is again answering a single question about the data in our workbook. The question this is answering is, can you please show me the year-to-date expenses by office compared to department? So every Excel pivot table can answer a single question. It can be a complex question, but it is just a single question, and you can have as many pivot tables in your workbook as you need to get all of the questions you want to have answered. It's possible to put more than one field into the row area, the column area, or the data area if you'd like to get a comparison of different things. For example, maybe I'd like to see the number of people in each office and in each department. Let's take the employee number, because the employee number is unique to each person. I don't want to group together all of the people named Steve in my list, so instead I'll take the employee number and I'll drop it here in the values area. Now I have, in addition to the year-to-date expenses by office and by department, I also have a count of the people in each of those offices. I think I do. Let's take a look. Oh, look down here in the values area. It's the sum of year-to-date expenses and the sum of the employee numbers. That's not what I want. I want to count the employees. So let's click here. Let's go to value field settings and change it to count. And when we click OK, now I have a count of the number of employees side by side. You'll notice that everything is kind of stacked across to the right as columns. And if we look here in the field area, we'll see that values are grouped together as columns. If we wanted to, we can take the values and group them together as rows. I prefer it this way. You may prefer it the other way. It can work either way. Okay, let's say that we'd like to remove some data from this pivot table. We've got a lot going on here. It might be a little bit too complex to show someone all at once. So what we're going to do is go down here to where it shows us the values area. Right here, count of employees. I'm going to take that and drag it outside of the area. You see the small X when I release. That removes that data from my pivot table, and it's reverted to the simpler question that I was asking just a moment ago. The next thing I'd like to show you is how you can drill into data to get more information about a total. For example, we're asking a question here, year-to-date expenses by office and by department. And if you see here, I've got this amount right here, $6,198. I might be wondering, where does this total come from? In Excel, you double click on the pivot table on this cell, and it will create a new copy of the data on a separate sheet right here that combines all of the rows that contributed to that total amount. So we can see where that number comes from by looking here. Again, this is a copy of the data, so once you have your understanding, you can safely right-click and delete this worksheet without damaging your workbook. So that $6,198 came from all of those rows we saw just a moment ago. The next thing I'd like to show you is how you can filter your information by a specific field. For example, maybe I was interested in seeing how these expenses stacked up, but I wanted to know how they were distributed across different titles. Right now I'm looking at every type of person across the firm. Maybe what I'd like to do instead is say, let me grab this title and drop it here into this filter area. This is a top-level filter that allows you to visualize data just for a subset of the rows in your table. For example, if we look up here, we can see that title is now available at the top. It's showing all. The table looks exactly the same as before. Now if I click this, I can say, you know what, let me look at the year-to-date expenses based on associates. So if I click OK, this filters the data to show me just the associates who have year-to-date expenses. If I click here, I can change it to, perhaps I'd like to see by partners. If I select partner and I click OK, this shows me just the partners. And of course, if I'd like to choose more than one of these, I can check the box for select multiple items, which changes these into select boxes, and I can collect as many as I like. So let's go ahead and go back to all departments and click OK here. One other thing to show you is perhaps I'd like to show all of the expenses, but I don't wish to include one of these values. I can choose to exclude an option by clicking the filter here and unchecking the department that I wish to not include, and then the totals recombine themselves based on the numbers that are visible. So these are just a few ways that you can manipulate data in your workbook to get insights about data using a pivot table. And there's an important thing to note before we close. That important thing is this. This pivot table is based on the data on this sheet. And if you change the data on this sheet, for example, let's say that we change this $1,500 here to $15,000 or $150,000, you won't see the data on the workbook adjust. And the reason you won't see it adjust is because that information does not get included in the pivot table until you go back to the pivot table tab and refresh, which asks the pivot table, please look again at the source data and make any updates as necessary. So when I click this, you'll see our numbers have changed. Pivot tables by default do not automatically update themselves when you change the underlying data. It's important for you to remember that. You can go to your pivot table options and click options here and check a box so that your data will refresh whenever you open the file. But if you don't do that, you need to remember, if I change the underlying data, I need to go back to the pivot table tab and click refresh to refresh my entries. That's a brief overview of pivot tables in Microsoft Excel. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for watching.